What is up, everybody? Bootman here, and we are back with another Marvel Snap video, and I am super duper excited for you all to check out this video. As you already saw by the title and the thumbnail, I have the awesome Jeff Hoogland on the channel to talk about everything bounce decks, all right? So bounce decks are one of the most popular archetypes right now, but it's also one of the strongest. So a little bit of a backstory. When I found bounce decks, I was like, this is my new favorite thing. I absolutely love them. But as Jeff and I will discuss, they are one of the more complex decks to play. You really got to plan things ahead. You got to make sure you don't make certain mistakes. So Jeff is one of the best bounce deck players that I've seen. So I want to bring him on the channel, talk to him, pick his brain about bounce decks, different strategies, how it pairs up to other decks. Is it too strong? Does it need a nerf? Thoughts about, bounce in the current meta, all that kind of stuff. And then we go through a list of different bounce deck variations, and I try to get his thoughts on which ones he thinks are good, bad, need some adjustments, and all that kind of stuff. But I know a lot of you want to get into playing bounce decks, but some of you look at it and you're like, oh, this looks a little too complex. So he offers a lot of great tips in this conversation. So I'm still like getting my footing together for this type of content where I bring on creators to discuss decks and everything like that. So this one we actually were recorded, and we were on his stream at the same time and everything like that. So I hope I've edited it to your liking and it looks nice, but yeah, just bear with me. There's gonna be some growing pains as I smooth out this process. All right, but before we get started, make sure you head down to the description. I've provided Jeff's socials. The dude streams every day during the week, and I'm usually just have his stream up lurking as I'm like doing work and stuff like that. So I have some snap going on and stuff like that. But he's a super cool dude to stream. He also uploads like pretty much daily content and different deck highlights. And I really respect the fact that he doesn't he's one of the few creators that doesn't like overhype decks. Like he will not make a video on his YouTube channel about a deck if he thinks it is bad. And if he does think it's bad, he's like, hey, this deck's really bad, but it's pretty fun. So I have a lot of respect for the dude. So make sure you head down to the description, follow Jeff over on Twitch, subscribe to his YouTube channel, follow him on Twitter so you stay up to date, all that kind of stuff, all right? And before we get started, if you're new here, if you're just meeting me, hi, my name's Chris. I also go by Bootman, and I make a ton of Marvel Snap content. I try to upload as much as possible. So make sure you subscribe, ring that notification bell. We also have an awesome Discord community down in the description below. And if you follow me on Twitter at BootmanMSTZ, also linked down in the description below. Everything you need it's linked down there, all right? But if you follow me on Twitter too, I do monthly season pass giveaways, all right? We have the Phoenix Force season coming up next week. So this weekend, I will be doing the giveaway, all right? So yeah, you gotta be subscribed, gotta follow me on Twitter if you want a chance to win. I give away 3 season passes for free every single month, all right? But anyways, I'm gonna shut up now. Here is my interview with Jeff Hoogland so you can learn how to master bounce decks. All right, so today we're gonna be talking a little bounce. So first up, why do you, sir, personally enjoy the bounce archetype oh so much?
I think the bounce deck in Marvel Snap is quintessentially everything that's good about Marvel Snap as a game. Just the volume of sequencing decisions and the number of permutations you have that you're like turns 3 through 6 tend to play out with is just like way more dense than any other deck in the game, right? Like you think about how like the high evolutionary decks, for example, play out. Like your turn 6 is like, where do I play Hulk and where do I play Wasp?
Yeah.
And your turn 6 in the bounce deck is just like literally that math video meme where you're like trying to calculate where all your cards are going and which ones give you the most numbers versus their numbers, etc.
Yeah, so with that, like, so me personally, I enjoy bounce because kind of like what you're saying, is there's like a lot of variety with it. I get bored with like those straightforward, just kind of like linear decks, like when Shuri was at the top of the meta, kind of high evolutionary. Like, do you find like you're more engaged with the game when you get to interact and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I played the kind of stock Sora and Shuri deck that's been going around and performing very well recently. Yesterday, a little bit on stream, and it was just coming back to be like, oh my god, I forgot how dry this deck was. Just like, yep, Shuri on 4, Red Skull on 5. Where does the Taskmaster go on 6? If anything, the Shuri nerf actually made that deck even more straightforward. You don't even get to choose
Oh,
where you're
yeah.
playing your card on turn 5. It's like, this is definitively here where we put the Shuri down.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So with bounce, I'm curious your thoughts because it's a bunch of little cards, little numbers at first, they get big, but why do you think it's so strong? Like when I was checking Untapped, it's, with certain settings, it's at the top of the meta. So why do you think bounce is so strong?
Well, so there's two facets that made bounce really strong. The first is that we had a metagame shift
Mm,
because of a balance change. Previously, one of bounce's biggest predators was the Galactus deck, because you just weren't playing any cards that could interact with putting cards into their lane. But now with Galactus's play percentage reduced, and even when you run into it, you can just put big numbers into their path. That change made it so there isn't this big natural predator for this archetype in the game
mhm.
anymore.
Yeah, do you so, like, I've seen people say, it does pair, well against, like, high evo lockjaw and stuff like that. Sometimes I do struggle a bit with it. Like, do you think it can keep up with decks like that from High Evolutionary that are reducing your power and then dropping, like, a 20 power Hulk, possible Infinite? Do you have any tips for going up against such a massive deck like that?
Well, I actually think the cards in the high evolutionary deck that like penalize your cards, things like Wasp and Cyclops, they're actually not stellar into the bounce archetype,
Mm,
both because you have Bast and because you can reposition where your things are at on the board. And with the addition of Hitmonkey to this archetype from that season pass a little while back, this deck is able to produce big numbers that can compete with a Hulk. If
mhm.
they're putting a 20 power Hulk and a 3 power Wasp into a lane, sometimes you can just put 24, 25 or
Yeah.
more into that lane and go over the top of what they're doing.
Yeah. Do you think, or have you noticed when you go up against opponents, do you think that they're not quite able to do the math and fully understand how much power you're about to drop on turn 6 when you have, like, the Mysterio, the Hitmonkey, the Kitty Pride, and all that?
110%. I can't tell you the number of times where I'm just like, I'm deep in the tank because they're still in the game on turn 6. And I'm just like, what do they have? What are they getting me with? Because the obvious plays don't do anything against any of my permutations. And then I'm just like, I can't think of anything. Fine, I'll ship it. If you got me, you got me. And I like put my cards out and they just make the obvious play that loses to what I was doing every single time. Just like, oh, you just had no
Yeah.
idea what numbers I could produce or where they were going. And Kitty's a big part of that, right? Like, so much of your power is back in your hand and can be deployed anywhere. And
Hmm.
people are bad at figuring out where it's likely going to go.
Yeah. So since so many people are playing bounce now, do you have like any quick math tips since you're the math guru? Like if you're going up against a mirror, how do you know what they're about to drop? Like, how do you go through all those different variations of, like, do they have Hitmonkey? Are they running, like, whatever?
Honestly, when both of the bounce decks get going, it's kind of like a New York situation
Mm,
where like there's so many permutations in the way both sides can play out the turn that it almost becomes less skillful because there's no levels when there's potentially so many different optimal things that like you can kind of run through it. But at the end of it, you're just like, all right, I'm just like committing to these two paths and hoping that it lines up well into whichever paths they end up committing to.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So, when Kitty originally came out in her glory, she functioned a little bit differently. They found out it was going to break the game, or they had to like redo everything, so they changed her. A lot of people were freaking out and losing their minds. Were you concerned at first, or did you think some of the changes were a little bit overblown? I guess the same question for Beast when they changed him from a 3/4, because when anything gets changed in the community, they're like, oh my God, this is dead. Like, what were your initial thoughts? Did you have to like stew on it a little bit and think about it?
So my initial read on Kitty Pride when they changed her due to mechanically making the game function around her, as
Hmm.
I expected her to be a little bit worse, but still very playable than her original design. And now, months later, after playing with her a ton, I actually think she's much better than
Really?
her original design, in large part due to the fact of how she allows you to manage priority. The fact
Yeah.
that her stats just never count on the board is a huge deal. And her previous design didn't work like that. Because you chose to pull her back and replay her, she stayed on the board and counted towards you having priority, which made her way more susceptible to Killmongers and Shang-Chi's and Shadow Kings.
Yeah, so that brings up the next question. Like I didn't even remember that you would still have priority because you had to pull Kitty back. So you've discussed this a little bit on stream, but for my lovely audience who haven't heard you discuss this, like with Bounce being so strong, what are your thoughts on like Kitty losing you priority? Because I know when I go up against mirrors and I'm testing new decks and stuff, it drives me absolutely insane. Like I'm just constantly thinking of like, how do I trick them into having priority so I can throw down a Killmonger or whatever? So like, do you think the deck needs to be changed at all or adjusted by Glenn and the team?
I think per the metrics that we've seen in Conquest, especially, that I would be surprised if this deck doesn't get some small amount of adjustments. And honestly, I would bet Second Dinner's data is trending in that direction too, because they adjusted Beast before it was apparent in any of the public data sources that we have available that Bounce was the best deck. So
Mm,
I would bet that Bounce has been trending as this deck is strong or potentially too strong in their internal metrics for a little bit now, based on that Beast change that we already saw.
yeah. So here's something that I've been running into. So when I'm going up against Bounce, and I'm sure others have this problem, or hopefully they have this problem. When I'm going up against another Bounce deck, I'm trying to make sure that I don't have priority, right? And it's difficult. But when you're playing Bounce, like, and you have an Angela on the board or the Collector, uh, or Bishop, those are constantly getting stronger. Do you have any strategies for like making sure that you don't have priority so you don't get killmongered and stuff like that? Like I faced like 10 destroy decks last night, right? But
Yep.
my bishop and my collector are doing their thing, and it's like, what do I do about that?
In the matchups where you need to not have priority, the big thing that comes up is you need to, generally speaking, only be playing to a single path. And that needs to be the path that your opponent is typically giving up in the game. Like it doesn't typically feel good to like commit Angela and Bishop to the same path or Collector and Bishop, etc., to your payoffs to the
Mm,
same path, but it's necessary in order to make sure that you're not getting killmongered in those spots. And then you just like figure out how to win your second path down the line once their thing has been spent or on turn 6.
got it. That makes sense. So here's another conundrum I think bounce players run into. All right, Jeff, let's toss you in this scenario. Turn one, your opening hand, you got Kitty and Angela. All right. What are your turns one, two, and three? So, because me personally, I'm like Kitty, Kitty, and then Angela, Kitty on three. I'm like, Angela will get big later. I'll just keep playing Kitty. Do you do that, or like, do you throw down Angela on turn two?
So that opening sequence actually depends on a lot of context. And the two things that are contextual to what you're doing in that opening sequence are the other cards in your hand and the matchup that you're playing.
Mhm,
So the big thing about the matchup that you're playing is if you're playing into a deck that's going to be waving or sandbanning you and making your kitty bad in the late game, then you
mhm,
want to prioritize getting Angela bigger by playing her out on turn 2. The other consideration for cards in your hand is, well, if I play Angela on turn 2, am I going to have other things on turn 3 that allows me to efficiently use my resources alongside playing Kitty out there? So, for example, if my opening hand is Kitty, Angela, and Collector, I will probably go Kitty on 1, Collector or Angela on 2, and then Collector Kitty or Angela Kitty on turn 3, just because I'm envisioning what my curve is looking like for those early turns optimally.
got it. All right, that makes sense. So you often say that bounce is one of the harder decks to play. And yeah, like you often say like you've played so much bounce, like you got your like your inked beast and all that kind of stuff, right? But like what do you think makes it so difficult, or what are like the common mistakes that you see like beginners make with the bounce deck? Like if somebody's like, hey, I want bounce, but it looks too complex, what can they do to get started?
Well, the complexity is even just highlighted in the previous question that we talked about, right? Like the
Mm,
average deck in Marvel Snap, you look at your opening hand and it tends to be relatively straightforward, like where what you're doing on turn 1, 2, and even 3 a lot of the time, with the big question just being like, which location are you deploying those cards to? Whereas the bounce deck, you look at the curve of this deck, the energy cost in it, and there's so many different combinations of what you can be doing starting on turn 2 that puzzling out what is optimal with that sequencing is a big deal. for example, a thing that even myself, you'll see me mess up. I messed it up in the last tournament I played bounce in, basting your own demon from Hood, for example, just
Yeah.
thinking about the order these cards are playing and having a big impact on the outcome of the game that you're playing.
Yeah, yeah, no, that was gonna be my next question. How do you avoid basting your demon? So, but it's nice to hear that you still do it too. All right, so now I sent you over this list because there's a lot of different bounce decks floating around. So I kind of want to go over these, get your thoughts on it. What do you think makes the list good? What makes it bad? Do you think there could be improvements? So the first one is kind of the traditional bounce list, but recently I think you and I talked about it in Discord, but like this one is running SpiderHam and not Iceman since SpiderHam
Yeah.
came out. What are your
So
thoughts on this one?
you have this label as traditional, and in my deck editor I call this stock bounce. In
Okay.
my mind, when someone says I'm playing the bounce deck, like these are the 12 cards that pop up for me. And I'm a pretty big fan of, if you're saying, Jeff, what bounce deck do I start with, this is my recommendation in terms of power level. I think this is the most well-rounded deck list that's not trying to do anything cute or tricky to try and make single matchups better at the cost of some others.
Yeah. So the next one is with Iceman. Like, have you experimented and played with both, like Iceman instead of Spider-Ham? Well, you obviously played with Iceman prior to Spider-Ham being released, but like, do you think Spider-Ham is better than Iceman in this list? And if so, why is that?
So an interesting metagame consideration that's happened recently is that Shuri's been reintroduced back into the format, and Iceman is significantly better against Shuri than Spider-Ham is,
Hmm.
because hamming a Red Skull is actively detrimental. Sometimes you can tag a Taskmaster, but Iceman is so good in that matchup. Anytime you Iceman Shuri or Red Skull or whatever their follow-up to Shuri is, you get so far ahead with the tempo that gets generated. So
Mm,
I think overall, I would consider the ham build to be the stock optimal one, but I think there is metagame merit to playing Iceman in that slot still.
gotcha. So real quick, total side question, just because I feel like more people should know about this, and I just learned about it from a fellow content creator paper. Have you seen what happens when you Spider Ham something and then you Shadow King the pig?
Yes. Yeah, we played a couple of decks built around that
Did
where it like has base 0 power, so Shadow King wipes it away as a neat interaction.
do you think that's should be working as intended, or do you think that's too powerful? It seems like it's like kind of a difficult combo to pull off,
I think
right?
I think that's fine. I think making Shadow King have a new edge case where it's useful is fine. I think
Gotcha.
a comment from, I don't know, is Tech Bounce does this? Yeah. So the next Tech Bounce deck is a little bit more all in on what this is, but I think a consideration too is talking about Spider Ham versus Iceman is it
Hmm.
could kind of be a both scenario. So like I think if you like wanted to head Shuri, for example, in the traditional bounce list without Iceman, I might consider like giving up Hood, for example, as a different one drop to get Iceman in there in addition to Ham.
Mm, gotcha. So speaking of that, like, because I've seen people taking out Hood. Hood seems to be getting the short end of the stick here. Like, do you think like these decks run decently without getting like a couple six power demons out there and all that?
So you definitely have enough payoffs even without Hood. If you look at the stock deck, things that make big numbers for you are Collector, Kitty,
Mm,
Bishop, Hitmonkey, and Angela. So you have 5 things. Hood's the 6th. I think the biggest consideration for swapping out Hood is not only obviously getting utility of something like Iceman in the Shuri matchup, but
hmm.
playing Hood makes your deck worse into Killmonger is a very real consideration.
Yeah.
Hood can also, in general, make it more difficult for you to not have priority in spots because often you're needing to fit those demons in early, which add a lot of stats to the board.
Yeah, for sure. So that next one was Tech Bounce. So this one's running Shang-Chi and Iron Man in it. What are your thoughts on this build? Like, I've played around with it, and like, it's nice having the Shang-Chi in there. Sometimes you just don't need him, so he's a dead card, but
I think Shang-Chi is some hot nonsense in this archetype. I think I think Iron Man is fine, especially with the reintroduction of Shuri into the format, where like Iron Man is really good into their Red Skull path as like a one card. Okay, I win your Shuri path with like Iron Man plus like whatever other chaff is there.
Mhm.
But I think Shang-Chi and Iron Man kind of do the same thing in terms of letting you go over the top of a big path, and playing both feels incredibly redundant. And I think Iron Man does that go over the top thing better than
Mhm.
Shang-Chi does in this archetype.
Got it. So the next one, very similar list, but instead of Shang-Chi, we have Jeff in there. This is the list that Lamby just used to win the UK Creator Clash. What are your thoughts on this one squeezing in Jeff?
Um, I will say one thing about like this particular build is that like you are, and honestly the one before it too is also true of, is these, you look at the cards these builds are giving up to fit these cards in, and we only have Kitty, Bishop, Angela, Hitmonkey, and Iron Man to like a lesser extent. So we only have like 4 to 5-ish things that like really put big numbers into play
Mhm.
once we lose Hood and Collector. But perhaps if you're just always planning to win your Iron Man path, that's good enough. I don't know that I love Jeff in this deck. Like it's obviously like it's hard for Jeff to be terrible because it's a pretty generically good card.
Mhm.
But I'm skeptical, especially in a world where Doctor Doom still sees a lot of play, that like me adding 3 power into a path that they can probably skate a 4 power Doombot into is really gonna get me that many things.
Yeah. So with these last couple lists and even the final one that we're about to go over, these are not running Falcon. So like
Yep.
the thing that I've run into is like you're solely relying on Beast to even make this like a bounce type deck. You know what I mean? Like, do you think these decks become weaker when you don't have two ways to do the thing that you're trying to do?
Yeah, and I talked about being concerned about the amount of stats that these builds can put into play. And one of the big thing that Falcon loses you in these decks is your Angela becomes a significantly worse payoff, because the primary thing Falcon is doing is adding somewhere between 2 to 6 points of power to your Angela path over the course of a given game, in addition to giving you repeats of your enters play effects.
Hmm.
That being said, SpiderHam is definitely a card that is less good when played 2 to 3 times over the course of the game than
Yeah.
some of these other things. So there's definitely some give and take there, as I can see why they would want to be trimming that card.
So, question that might turn into a controversial answer. Why do you think, like for example, Lamby's list, why do you think it won the creator clash? You know what I mean?
Uh,
Like if there is a more
I
optimal version?
I think Lamby is a very good Marvel Snap player, and I think the bounce deck. I think if you said Jeff, I'm going to replace 2 to 3 cards in the bounce deck completely at random. Can Lamby win a tournament with it? I'd be like, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Like, I think if you take what's arguably one of the best decks in the format, and especially if you're just putting like other generically good cards in it, right? Like I said, it's hard for Jeff to be that terrible of a card, right? Like it's a
Yeah.
generically very good card. The Iron Man serves a purpose. So I think this build is doing some things that are like kind of cute for the sake of being good in particular matchups. And if you hit those matchups, it's a very strong payoff, right? So
Yeah.
I think a build like this is like making itself a bit worse in some average case scenarios to make yourself better in some scenarios that you really want to beat. And that's a fine risk to be taking, especially when you're going into a tournament where you're expecting people to be trying really hard to win.
Yeah, yeah, and they had an open deck list. But you bring up an interesting point, and it is something I think about a lot. So we're talking in the context of Lamby using this list, and KM Best actually won Infinity Conquest with the same list. So something I'm regularly thinking about is our audiences, right? What's their average skill level? Like, do you think the audience should be, I don't know, just look at it like in that context of like, hey, a really good player is posting this list and maybe I should, take that into consideration, right? Like they have the skill set to use a little bit of a different list than what I might be able to use. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I frequently tell players that like whatever you see your favorite content creator who's like infinite every season and like running through Conquest Calls, whatever their win rate or cube rate is with the deck, you should knock some amount of percentage points off that when you try and apply it to yourself, regardless of what the deck is.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So the last one on here was, this is a list that Den brought to the tournament, which doesn't run Chavez, has Valkyrie in here, no Iron Man, also using Jeff, uh, and it has Electra in it. So there was a list like this running around for a little bit. I used it a little bit when Evo was a little bit more popular. I've seen it toned down a little bit in Conquest, but anyways, what are your
I
thoughts on it?
think cutting Chavez from the bounce deck is the number one biggest cardinal sin you can commit in the archetype.
Yeah.
I think I think Chavez is, in my experience talking to other people about the bounce deck, it's the number one card people that haven't played the deck enough really like to cut. And it's easy to see why. Chavez, the benefit that she provides is so hard to feel when you're
Hmm.
playing your game just because she's giving you this small consistency boost in all of your early turns. And Marvel Snap, the way you see, 75% of your deck in a given game, it's typically very easy to get a feel for a change when you make it because you often draw that card. But because Chavez is just deck smoothing essentially, a lot of people tend to undervalue that type of effect. I
Yeah.
also think in a world where people are waving you on turn 5 with some consistency, cutting Chavez becomes even more egregious because often if you're counter playing into turn 5 wave and Conquest, especially, you're just like, okay, I play out on 5 and then I play my 9 power thing somewhere on turn 6.
Yeah. So, question about that, real quick. Last question about these lists here. With Chavez running into wave, when I run into that scenario, like I'm sitting here with like an 8 power kitty, right? And then they wave, and I'm just like, I guess I get a little bummed out that my kitty is now just useless. All that hard work I was doing. I guess you're buffing Angela and all that, but is there anything that you do like when you're playing that turn 5 and like kind of dumping things like? Do you have a consideration for Kitty? Will you play something over Kitty if they're about to wave on 5 because Kitty's just not going to be useful on that turn 6? You know what I mean? I know there's a few different scenarios where that answer might change, but any kind of scenario we can look at?
I think the big consideration for Kitty Pride in those turn 5 wave matchups, especially in Conquest, is what goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier when it comes to early game sequencing, which is being hyper aware of the fact that turn 5 wave could be a possibility in the game that you're playing, and
Mhm.
then structuring your sequencing in the earlier turns so you're not so focused on maximizing Kitty so much as you are focused on using her to maximize the other payoffs that you have that will be staying on the board, with the accepting of the fact that, hey, this probably isn't going to end the game on the board.
Gotcha. Cool. So I got one more question for you. You tweeted something out about Conquest mode now that it's out and everything. What are your tips for avoiding tilt in Conquest? I just finally tried Infinity Conquest last night and wanted to break my phone. So how are you approaching it? What tips do you have for the world out there now that Conquest is here and people want that shiny little avatar border?
You gotta learn to love losing, Chris. You gotta just like accept that you're more than your results, and it's just this little shiny avatar thing that ultimately doesn't mean much. There's a sense of accomplishment that you're chasing more than anything. And I think most importantly, just like keeping track of your mental as you play the game, and then kind of be aware of like when you're in a bad spot, and like don't hit the requeue button when you're in a bad spot after a loss. Like take a break, play something else, play a ladder match with a different deck,
Mhm.
shake it out, play a proving grounds match with a fun deck that you really don't care about the results of, but you just like playing. Just, change of pace is everything.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. All right. Actually, I'm gonna squeeze in one more question. Real quick. High Evolutionary is everywhere. People want it nerfed. What would you do to change the deck or the cards that are in the deck?
I would start with Wasp and Hulk because those are the two cards that are in both of the decks. Like the Lockjaw build is the most popular one. I think Wasp being 3 power that's repeatable power as you like re-lockjaw it constantly is too much. You probably just like tone that down to only -1 to one thing. And
Mhm.
then Hulk probably goes from 2 to 1, but I don't know that you necessarily have to do both of those things simultaneously.
Yeah.
Like maybe you try one and see if it sticks and then try the other, but I also wouldn't be upset if they did them both at the same time.
Gotcha. Cool. So thank you so much for your time, Jeff, and for the
Can I sneak one in here for you?
oh, geez. Okay, yeah, let's do it.
So we were talking about bounce builds. You actually missed one that I like.
Uh-oh.
So I'm gonna give you a link here. So this has been one of my recommendations for people that are like, okay, how do I play bounce without Hitmonkey? So this is just like was the bounce deck before Hitmonkey released. And something that I've talked about before is there's just been so many things to explore. I haven't even had a chance to get back around to it.
Yeah.
Is that this build I think has merit, especially in a post Shuri world where like being able to Korg them and Black Widow them on top of Iceman to really disrupt what they have going on is really appealing.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, I totally forgot. This is like the original. Do you think this would pair up with some of the other decks that are currently in the meta, like High Evolutionary and all that? Still has Collector and all that, so should still be
I
decent.
think this core is super reason. I think even if you have Hitmonkey, this core is worth considering just to get some play out of it. Korg is really sweet into their lockjaw path. You know, put some rocks in their deck to be able to brick their Jubilees or their dogs on occasion. You could even work, if you want to go full disruption, you could work Ham into this build too over something like Hood or Black Widow potentially as well.
You don't think there's a massive decrease in power? I'm not seeing our man Bishop in here.
So I think Collector and Hawk are really, really able to fuel that. You know, just going back to talking about your number of things that put stats into play, you know, we have Kitty, Collector, Darkhawk, Angela as 4 big things. Hood's another thing that kind of hits there. And then you also take into account the fact that like you are making your opponent's payoffs happen less consistently on the back of Widow, Iceman, and Korg.
Yeah. Hey, I might take this into the week and surprise some people with the old school build. Cool. But yeah, awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for hanging out, talking about bounce. For the 5 people in my audience who don't know, where can they find you at?
You just find me most places at Jeff Hoogland. You can find me on YouTube at Hooglandia Snap. Post new content there 7 days a week, edited up.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, I'll be lurking in your stream later.
Catch you later, Chris.